The next statement that we're going to look at in Java is the for statement. And this is not the simplest of loops, but it's perhaps one of the most common loops in Java. A for statement is a statement that allows you to loop through a series of statements or execute some code a number of times, and in that process it allows you to keep track of a counter or to do some action on every loop. So let me show you a simple example of a for statement, and what we're going to do is we're going to simplify this code. We're going to do a little bit of what's called refactoring here, and this code right now is a mess because it's really duplicating a lot of stuff here. We see that we have the same line kind of printed out in these different places, and when we want a case for printing one copy, we do one of these statements, and when we have the case for two, we just repeat it, and that's really inefficient, and it's really copying a lot of code. And so when this changes, if we wanted to make a case 3, we'd have to have 3 of these print lines, and that's really just not a good way to go. But with a loop, we can simplify this. So I'm going to create a loop up here. We'll go ahead and delete these statements. Now I'm going to show you how we can use a for loop. So the syntax of a for loop is you use for here, and then you have some parentheses. And there's 3 things that go into the parentheses, and they are separated by 2 semicolons here. So I'm going to put these semicolons in place. And I'm just going to put what each one of these is. So this first section here is going to be an initializer. The second section here is going to be the condition. And the third one is going to be an increment. So the idea here with a for loop is you need to initialize some variables or some kind of count. You check it. Every loop, it's going to check this condition and see if this condition still evaluates to true. If it doesn't, it's going to quit looping. And then you want to be able to increment. You want to be able to do something that changes the condition so that it will eventually end. So let's go ahead and see an example of this. So I'm going to use integer I here. I can declare a variable right inside this for loop. So I've declared a variable called I, and I is commonly used for a counter. You could use a name like count, and that's a little bit more descriptive, but for this example I'm going to use I to save a little bit of space here and make it easier to read. So here I've declared my variable I, I've set its count to 0, and we're going to loop until I is less than the number of copies. And then I have another semicolon here, and then every time we loop, we're going to use this I++. And if you remember, this I++ is the same thing as saying I equals I plus 1. What we're going to do is we're going to increment I every time. Now the same thing as with an if statement, we could just use one single line here, or we can use a block. Commonly in a loop you're going to use a block, and everything that's in this block is going to get executed every iteration of the loop, or every time this loop goes around. So right now, if we just looked at this structure here of this for loop that we have, we're going to start at 0. It's going to check and see, is I, which is start at 0, less than the number of copies? If it is, then it's going to increment I, and then it's going to go on and do what's in this loop. So, for example, if we put in a copies of 2, I is going to start at 0. I is going to be less than 2. 0 is less than 2. So then I is going to become 1. Then it's going to do whatever in here. And now we have an I equal to 1. It's not going to re-execute this initialization statement. Now it's just going to check this value. 1 is less than 2. So we're going to get I++, which is going to make it 2. Then we're going to execute what's in this loop. And now, is 2 less than 2? It's not, so we're done. So it's going to execute that loop 2 times. So let's actually change our code to make use of this, because what we're doing in our print method here is we're trying to print the number of copies. We want to print this statement, is on or is off, however many times that's passed in here. And we only supported 1 or 2, or the default. For the default, we said number of copies is not supported because we couldn't really support 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It would have been a lot of coding to write all that code, and we could never have supported 1,000. It would have been way too much typing in order to support that much. But using a loop, we can support pretty much any number of copies. So what we'll do here is we'll take this whole if statement and we'll just move it inside this loop. So now what we're going to do is, however many copies there are, is how many times we're going to go through this loop, and each time we're going to print either the model number and then either on or off. So we'll take out this old switch code, and you can see how much code that we've been able to eliminate just by getting rid of that switch statement and replacing it with a loop. This loop is going to be a lot more efficient. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And we'll go ahead and leave this 5. We'll print 5 times. You can see here it's printed 5 times. If I put a 1 in, it's only going to print once. If I put in 0, it won't print any times. It completely skipped it. And I could even put in 10 here, and it will work as well. You can see there's 10. So what's happened here? What happened when we put in 10? Well, we had 10 get passed in, it was set to copies, and we looped from 0 to 10. And this is one of those things that always confused me when I was first starting out programming, is how to initialize the for loop and how to know how many copies I want to do. It starts at 0, or do I start at 1? The best thing to do is just to kind of memorize this kind of convention here. So if you start at 0 and you always make your variable less than whatever the max is, you're going to get that number of iterations. So for example, when 10 comes in here, because we start at 0 and we're looping till I is less than 10, it's going to happen 10 times. You could also start at 1 and then say less than or equal to, but I find that a little bit more confusing. I think it's a lot easier to just remember to do it this way for a for loop. Now, for loops can be more complicated than this. We're not going to get into all the details here, but you could have multiple statements here. You could initialize different variables. You could have a complex condition here. The basic idea here is that you have this initialization that happens once when the loop is first entered. You have this conditional that is checked every time, and if it ever evaluates the false, the loop is done. And then you have this other statement that executes on every iteration of the loop that can access whatever variables you've declared here. There's one more refactoring I'd like to do here just to make this a little bit cleaner. You see that we are actually checking this if statement on every iteration of the loop. What we can do is we can pull this out and we can just check once to get our text here and use a variable and print out the value of the variable. So let's try that. Let's create a string, and we'll call this text to print, and we'll set this equal to model number plus, and then we need to have either is on or is off. So let's stop this thought for a second, and let's create another string, and let's put the is on or is off in this string. We'll call this string on status, and we'll set this equal to, let's set this equal to an empty string at first, and then we'll say if is on status equals is on, else on status equals is off. Now we can make our text to print be equal to our model number plus our on status, and then inside of our loop we can eliminate this whole if block, and we can just say system.out.print line, and we're just going to print the text to print. Now we've simplified things a lot better, and we've made it a little bit cleaner to read this code, and we're not executing this if condition every time we go around the loop. We're only executing this once to build our string, and then we're printing it out however many. So the next kind of loop that we're going to look at in Java is the for each loop. And this is one of my favorite looping constructs because I think it's a very elegant loop and it's very easy to do, and it makes a lot of tasks that would have been much harder, much easier to do. So in order to create this loop, I'm going to create an example here, and we're going to create a print statement that will allow us to print the different colors, red, green, and blue. And we could fill this with more than those colors, but let's just make an example where we have red, green, and blue, and we want to print those colors. So I'm going to create a method here called print colors, and it's not going to take any parameters. And the idea here is that we're going to create an array of colors as strings, and we want to print each one of these out. So I'm going to create a string array, and I'm going to use a special syntax here in order to create this string array. What I'm going to do is we're going to declare this string array just like we did before, and we're going to call this colors, and then we're going to do new string, and then we're not going to specify the length of the string like we had done with an array. We could have put 10 for 10 strings. Instead, we're going to let the compiler figure this out. Instead, we're going to use some brackets here, and then we're going to put our strings followed by commas, and the compiler will figure out how long to make the array. So I'm going to do red, comma, blue, comma, green. Then a semicolon at the end here. So now we have an array of colors. Now, a for each loop will let us basically iterate through this array, or really anything that is iterable in Java. And iterable is just a fancy way of saying that you can loop through it. There's a lot of things that you can loop through in Java. Anything that it would make sense to be able to loop through, like a list. In this case, we're going to use an array. And when we get into collections later, you'll see that we can loop through most collections. But we can use this for each loop in order to loop through this array. And the syntax for the for each, it looks just like a for. It's just the keyword for. It's called for each, but it's actually just for. And what you do is you declare the variable that's going to hold the temporary value of the element, the current element in the array, because it's going to go through each one of these. So we'll create a string, and we'll call this current color. And then use a colon here, and when you use the colon, you can think in your head in. So we would say current color in colors. And this is going to loop through every color stored in current color in this colors collection. So for each current color in colors, do this. And what we can do here is we can just do system.out.print line, and then we'll print whatever the current color is. So thinking about how this is going to work, it's going to look at this colors array. It's going to loop through until it's hit every single one of these, and it's going to store it in the current color each pass through. On the first pass through, it's going to have red stored in here. Then it's going to print out red. On the second pass through, it's going to have blue stored in here. It's going to print out blue. On the third pass through, it's going to have green, and it's going to print out green. So let's take a look at how this will work. So let's, instead of calling print, let's call print colors. And then let's run this and see what happens. You can see it's printed red, blue, green. So it's real simple. This is a very elegant loop. I really like this loop because you don't have to, like we had to do in this for loop, we had to figure out where to start and where to end. Instead, the for each loop is able to do that for you. All you have to do is choose a variable that you're going to store the current item in, and then use this colon and then your list or whatever collection, whatever iterable thing that you have. In this case, we have this array of colors. The other nice thing about this is that we can easily expand this. If I added yellow, comma, orange here, it's automatically going to work, and we don't have to do anything else. So I'll just run this, and you can see now it's added those colors. So for each loop is a really useful loop, and you just have to remember the syntax. It's the same as the for loop, except you're going to use this colon here, and you're going to declare your variable to store for each item, and then you're going to give the actual array